So just a bit of an idea, who are landholders in the group? Okay. Can I ask a question? Do you measure your emissions off your livestock, however that might be? Has anybody done their emissions intensity or got their emissions intensity numbers? Okay. Has anybody been asked for them? Okay, rightio. And that's pretty common as I travel around the countryside. But I'm going to give you a bit of a talk today, starting to think about some of the terms and definitions. So if you do get asked about emissions or emissions intensity, you can start asking the why. What do you want from me? How am I going to do that? And what do you actually want in terms of numbers? And where am I actually going to use that for? What are you going to use that information for? So hopefully get to that point in my very, very short talk today. Okay, so as I said, my name's Clare Edwards. I'm a Development Officer Carbon with the On-Farm Carbon Advice Team. And our role is supporting New South Wales farmers to transition to low emissions future. So I'm going to talk to you about where does all this fit in the big picture of things. I'm going to put you as a farmer first. And I'm going to start thinking around being a farmer, what happens in your world, but what's happening in the global world, and how do it all tie together, and you know where things like the ACCUs sit as well. Okay, so hopefully I can draw on this. I haven't kind of asked that. It's not a permanent marker. I have that habit. Okay, so you might have your farm. Okay, you might have a river down here, and on your farm you've got a number of things that are happening. You've got your infrastructure. You might have some silos. You might have some trees out the back. Lucky for you, I did ag science at uni, not fine arts. Okay, so some trees. We might have some wheat. This probably looks like cotton actually, but anyway, at the back here. We might have some livestock. Now, this is not a cloud with feet, sheep. Laugh, please. Please, please laugh. Okay, I cannot draw cattle. And we've got maybe a tractor kind of ploughing a field up as well. Okay, some emissions, okay. Maybe you should put a horn on it. Okay, nothing too serious, okay. And we might have some good soil, which might have some good microbes and things. These are not giant snakes, these are just worms in the soil, okay? So we've got good soil health going as well. So we have a number of things which are happening on the farm. Electricity coming into the farm. And we have a number of things which are emitting on the farm. And we talk about emissions in terms of the 3 greenhouse gases. We're talking about CO2, which is carbon dioxide. We're talking about methane, and we're talking about nitrous oxide are the 3 main greenhouse gases. And so we know there's emissions coming off your farm. And we know there's also storage of carbon, but there's also sequestration of carbon as well. And we'll come back to that in a moment. And we have been talking to you about having good ground cover. We've been talking about having good soil health. I don't know how many, 28, 29 years, been talking about having good organic carbon, good organic matter. Having good organic matter is good for soil health, for the microbes, for the physical nature of the soil, but also for the chemical nature of the soil. So we've been talking about those, good herd and flock management, animal health, all those things. So we've been talking about all those things for many years with you. And they also are part of, when we're talking about emissions efficiencies and farm efficiencies, knowing those things are actually some of the things that we can do now. But we're going to hear today some of the things that we can do in terms of the near future and some of the research. Okay, so what we do have on a farm, and you think, well, yeah, I've got emissions and sequestration. What does that really mean for the rest of what's happening out there? As I said, if anybody wants to come and draw the world, this is the world. So, okay, we've got New Zealand, we haven't got Tassie, here we are. Okay, so globally there's a few things happening. And as a farmer, we're thinking, what we hear on the news is happening, the COPs, the Conference of Parties, the COPs, the IPCCs. What else is out there? I've got the Paris Agreement. Oh, I always forget the Paris Agreement. And these are things that we hear on the news, that potentially, you know, do they really influence me on the farm per se? I did this with some Western Australians the other day and I forgot a bit about Western Australia. Tasmania's really easy. Yeah, that's Australia. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. Okay, in Australia we've got a couple of things. And we've actually said that the government said that they want to reduce their emissions by 43% based on 2005 baseline emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2050. We've also done things like pledged that we're going to reduce our methane, not to zero, but reduce our methane. And we've also got things like the climate financial related disclosure. And I can't do the D. We've also got things like the nature repair bill. So we have a number of big picture things happening in Australia. In New South Wales, we've got some things which are happening as well. And we've got things like, we've actually said that we're going to reduce our emissions by 50% based on 2005 emissions baseline by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And we also have a couple of New South Wales things in around the Biodiversity Acts and things like that as well. So there's kind of these things which are over here. Do they influence me as a farmer over here? Another thing to remember in New South Wales, when we look at all the emissions in New South Wales, roughly 18% based on 2022 data is around agriculture. So 18% is from agriculture. And it does go up and down. It does 15 or 18 depending on the livestock numbers at the time. And so 18%, while it's not huge, if the energy, transport and all those guys get their acts together and they're actually reducing their emissions, then that 18% can be a lot higher as a percentage. So that's one of the things to remember around agriculture. Okay, so we've got a couple of things happening that are kind of more influenced in the farmer than perhaps what's happening globally. In terms of industry, we may have heard of the Ag Framework, Ag Sustainability Framework, and that's partly saying that one of the things that they're looking at is knowing about greenhouse gas emissions. We might have heard of CN30. Well, MLA's changed their rhetoric around, or I suppose their comments around CN30, but that's kind of the industry side of things. They're looking at emissions. We also have the corporates, and these corporates, some of them have got net zero ambitions or goals, not only in Australia, but globally as well. They've got things like the climate financial related disclosure, which is looking at things like where the emissions are coming from, scopes 1, 2 and 3. We also have things like environmental, social and governance in the corporates. And we also have market access, which I will get back to in a minute. We have banks in the mix of things, and the banks are also looking at net zero as aspiration, climate financial related disclosure stuff, and ESG. So they're also in this space as well, but they're also talking about sustainability linked loans and also things like green loans. So they're kind of in this space as well. We've got the consumers. And some of those consumers are asking their emissions footprint or the carbon footprint. And things like what we call ethical buying and things like that come into play. So they're kind of some of the kind of levers, I suppose. Then we've got a whole heap of other things happening. We've got, as I said, agriculture is only 18% of emissions in New South Wales. We have transport, we have aviation, all those things which are also emitting as well. So they're looking at reducing their emissions. In Australia, we have what we call the safeguard mechanism. And this captures those big emitters. And those big emitters, this is a safeguard mechanism. That tells me I've got 5 minutes to go. Okay, so we've got, oh, sorry, that's me. everywhere. Safeguard mechanism. So we've got the big emitters, and the big emitters, they have to know their emissions, they have to reduce their emissions, they can buy offsets. There's a couple of other things they can do as well. So there's about 219 of these big emitters. So think about cement, think about energy, those kind of big emitters. And they're actually thinking about how they're reducing their emissions. If they can't reduce their emissions, then they can go and buy offsets. And they buy offsets through the carbon market, the ACCU scheme. Okay, so if they can't reduce their emissions, they buy offsets. And this is actually mandatory, compulsory. Okay? And the ACCU scheme has methods and eligible activities. And we're going to hear a bit about some of those in the soils talks this afternoon. So that's where the ACCU scheme is. That's the offsets. Okay? They buy offsets to offset their emissions, which they can't necessarily reduce in their industry. There are other carbon markets out there as well. And they've been in the marketplace for a little while. And there's also environmental markets. And we'll hear a lot more about those as we go along, as they're in their infancies as well. So things like BCT in New South Wales sits in the environmental markets, credits near me, that type of thing. So here, this is the link between the carbon market and you as a landholder. This is voluntary. This is not compulsory, this is voluntary. So somebody might say they've been involved with a carbon service provider and they're talking about their soil carbon and they're doing eligible activities on there and they're selling their carbon credits and they're selling it through the safeguard mechanism or whatever methods they're doing. So here we have the link. Now there's other links with the carbon market with things like methane off tips and landfill and things like that. So there's others, not just the ag and land sector. As I said, that's voluntary. If you decide to sell your carbon credits through your farm, you may not be able to, for example, your sequestration, you may not be able to use those against your own emissions. So when somebody's asking for your own emissions, you may want your sequestration, and this is what we're calling insetting, the word insetting. So another pen is what I need. Okay, so I just wanted to end by talking about the emissions side of things. In emissions, we're going to be hearing about your total emissions, emissions intensity, percentage emissions. They're all kind of metrics that we can use. The other one is around scopes 1, 2 and 3. And scope 1 is emissions on your farm. Scope 2 is emissions generated off farm onto your farm, such as electricity, for example. And scope 3 is when you're thinking about buying vaccines or feed or fodder, feed, fertiliser. Scope 3. And then when you sell your produce off, say an abattoir, okay, so this is not carrots, meat in an abattoir, or a feedlot, because I can't drill cattle and say in a feedlot. There we are, there's something, feedlot. For example, the abattoir is going to be thinking about its emissions, and it's thinking about where it's got its meat from and where it's been processed from, and so it's going to be looking at your farm. So this is the scope 1, 2 and 3, which you may have heard of. And when we start thinking about the corporates or we're thinking about the supply chain, you can start seeing that you're part of a supply chain that fits with some of the corporates. So if they're thinking about their emissions, they're thinking about how you fit in that supply chain. And so if you want to know a bit more about your emissions on farm and what percentage of your scopes might be on farm, then there are tools and calculators out there to do that. And I have some sheets out the back to help you look at some of the tools and calculators. When we're starting to think about emissions on farm, and if you've got livestock, when we're talking about the percentages, often those percentages are 70, 80 or 90% of those emissions coming from the enteric fermentation. And you'll hear a lot more about this today, but the enteric fermentation is actually quite interesting. It allows the animals, the ruminant animals, to take that complex carbohydrate and make it into products through their first stomach, which is the rumen, and burping out methane. So where methane's part of the process, we're going to hear about a lot of information about how we measure it and what we can do about it. This is some Richard Eckhart's work, and I actually like this because there's a whole heap of things here that he mentions about what we can do and what we can look at. And we're going to be looking at some of these today. We're going to be looking at dietary supplements. We're going to be looking at the plant secondary compounds in some legume work, or some pasture species work. We're going to be looking at some of these things out in the research side of things and what that means for you as a farmer. So while we started off with you as a farmer with your livestock, we're going to be having a look at some of the technology that's out there to measure it, so we know more about it and more about it for Australian conditions. We're going to talk about some of the things that you might be able to do on farm and some of the things that's available now for you. And then we're going to be talking about things like soil carbon this afternoon, some pastures and dietary supplements as well. So that's where we're heading today, to help you as landholders understand a bit more about the emission side of things and what the research is happening, and hopefully inform you a bit more about how we can measure it, but also be more efficient in the future. That's me.